أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين، حبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المنتجبين. صلى الله وسلم عليك يا رسول الله، صلى الله وسلم عليك يا أبا عبد الله، يا رحمة الله الواسعة ويا باب نجاة الأمة. يا ليتنا كنا معكم سيدي فنفوز فوزا عظيما. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قد أفلح المؤمنون الذين هم في صلاتهم خاشعون. صدق الله العلي العظيم. وصلوا على محمد وآل محمد. What is the science behind the effectiveness of the prayer? What is it that makes the prayer work? What is it that decides whether our prayers are answered or not answered? And when you look at that question, it may seem as an oxymoron, putting the word science and prayer in the same sentence. Because you may think that science is one language and prayer belongs to another language. It belongs to the language of faith and ritual and religion. And those two languages are separate from one another. They're two completely different subjects. That's why sometimes people who are confused and don't understand the reality, they'll say things like, I don't believe in religion, I believe in science. And the reality is that they are two languages that are not separate from one another. They are intertwined if you're able to understand the subtleties in the two. So, when it comes to prayer, in order to understand the science, what makes it tick? What makes it heard? How to properly pray, I want to cover 4 short areas. Number 1, answering the question of what is prayer? Number 2, what does the Holy Quran tell us about prayer? Number 3, the science and the application and the practical side of prayer. And number 4, the prayers as taught to us by Sayyid al-Shuhada, Abi Abdullah al-Imam al-Husayn alayhi salam, and his son al-Imam Zainul Abidin alayhum as-salam. So number 1, what is prayer? If you look at the word salah, the literal meaning of the word salah in Arabic is a supplication, a dua, to ask someone of something. However, the meaning gradually, over a period of time, the word salah became the definition for the ritual practice that is practiced by Muslims. You know, the 5 daily prayers, that sort of prayer, that sort of salah. So, in essence, it's a way of making a request. And normally that request comes through the form of speech, a spoken word. So there is formal prayer and there is also informal prayer. If you look at the Christian faith, there are prayers that are common. So Christians who pray, for instance, some of you may be more familiar with this. There's a daily prayer is the Lord's Prayer. Now, I haven't memorized it, but it begins with, I believe, Our Father in Heaven. And then it contains an element of, give us our daily bread. And it's a prayer for protection. It's a daily prayer. In the Catholic faith, there is the Hail Mary. And if you've done wrong and you've come to confess your sins, the priest will tell you, say 5 Hail Marys or say 10 Hail Marys. It's a prayer for intercession, in which Mary, the mother of Jesus, Maryam, the mother of the Prophet Isa, alayhi salam, is mentioned. In the Islamic viewpoint, There's different types of prayers. So you have your ritual prayer, and then you have any general dua that is spoken. Anything that you ask from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the Quran tells us of one of the first acts of prayer, one of the first acts of supplication, which was spoken by the Prophet Adam on behalf of himself and Hawa. It says in Surah Al-Baqarah, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Qala, they said, Qala Rabbana inna zalamna anfusana. O Allah, we have oppressed ourselves. وَإِن لَمْ تَغْفِرْ لَنَا وَتَرْحَمْنَا لَنَكُونَنَّ مِنَ الْخَاسِرِينَ. And if you do not forgive us, truly, we will be from the losers. So some people ask, when it comes to prayer, what do I ask for? Where do I start? A great place to start to answer that question is the Quran. The Quran has a number of prayers. The Quran has a number of supplications. This verse that I just mentioned, it's a supplication that Adam spoke. There are other supplications that are in the Quran. رَبَّنَا لَا تُؤَاخِذْنَا إِن نَسِينَا أَوْ أَخْطَأْنَا. Oh Allah, don't hold anything against us if we are forgetful, out of forgetfulness, or out of a mistake. I mentioned the other day the dua of the Prophet Ibrahim when he prayed for the safety and the sanctity of the city of Mecca, the Haram, the Kaaba. وَإِذْ قَالَ إِبْرَاهِيمُ رَبِّ اجْعَلْ هَذَا الْبَلَدَ آمِنًا. That's a prayer. To pray for the safety of your city, of your neighborhood, of your community, so that when you walk out in the streets, you feel safe. You're okay with your family going out. That's a prayer. So a number of prayers, if you don't know what to say, start with the Quran. Look at what the Quran says. There are a number of beautiful prayers and supplications that come directly from the Quran. Prayer is also a creative act. And every time you speak, and I mentioned this yesterday, the principle of be impeccable with your word. Every time you speak, not only do you describe your reality, you create your reality. And that's why people live at the level that they speak. So if you're always speaking negative, then you're going to live a negative life. But if you're always speaking positive and being inspirational and uplifting, well, that's also going to reflect in your life as well. So we live at the level that we speak. So you see most people today, they speak defeat into their life. They don't speak victory into their life. They speak about their problems, but they never speak about any solutions. And that's why their problems remain. Because if that's all that you're speaking, then that manifests itself in your life. So prayer goes beyond just a formality. Sometimes people are intimidated by a prayer because they think it's some formality. And yes, the ritual prayer is a formality. You have to be in a state of purity. There's a certain time for it. There's a certain place for it. But any words that are spoken from the bottom of the heart constitute a supplication and a prayer. And that's why you find in common language, people say, hey, pray for a miracle. When you pray for a miracle, when you find yourself in a situation where you're not necessarily going to stand and do wudu and face the qibla and make sure that your place is pure, you just start praying for a miracle, whatever comes to your heart. It's very interesting on that fact. When you study theology and when you study basically the proof of the existence of God, of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there are a number of arguments. The ontological argument, the teleological argument, a number of arguments that philosophers have come up with. Al-Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam has a beautiful hadith where he says the following. He says, do you want proof of the existence of a God? He says, if people are in a ship in the middle of the ocean and then it gets punctured by a hole and it starts to sink, who do those people call out to? Do they call out to the flying spaghetti monster? Who do they call out to? They call out to God. Do they say, oh Mother Nature, save me, oh Father Time, save me? The same people who will deny God, put them in a situation where they're praying for a miracle. Who do they pray for? They pray for God. They pray to God. They pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the words that you speak, and that's why there's truth to the statement, be careful what you wish for. What you wish for, what you speak about can very well come true, because every word that you speak is a seed that you plant. And that seed that you plant can grow into a tree, or it can germinate into an entire orchard. So be very careful of the words that you speak. This is part one. Part two, what does the Quran tell us about prayer? The Quran says the following. The believers, and there are three attributes here. Number one, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, and this is in chapter number 23, Surah Al-Mu'minun. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. قَدْ أَفْلَحَ الْمُؤْمِنُونَ الَّذِينَ هُمْ فِي صَلَاتِهِمْ خَاشِعُونَ. So number one is that in their prayer, they have khushu'. They are humble when it comes to their prayer. And the word khushu', coming from the root khasha'a. Khasha'a means to lower, when something is lowered. There's another verse in the Quran. وَخَشَعَتِ الْأَصْوَاتُ لِلرَّحْمَنِ فَلَا تَسْمَعُ إِلَّا هَمْسًا. That on the day of judgment, think of how descriptive the Quran is in terms of the day of judgment. It says that all of the voices shall be lowered, and you'll hear nothing except for soft sounds. Whenever you get a group of people together in a room, what tends to happen? It's very noisy. Now this group of people is very well behaved, alhamdulillah. I've been to, just to share with you, I was at a community one time where the voices were so loud that I could not hear my own sound go from my mouth to the microphone. So I thank you for your well behavior. But what happens? Everybody's voice begins to raise. Everybody engages in conversation. But what happens when someone grabs their attention? The voices go low. A number of years ago, I was in Rome visiting the Pantheon. I don't know if you've had the chance to do this, but it's one of those areas where obviously a lot of tourists go and visit. And I remember walking into this great building, and on the inside, it's marvelous, and it echoes. So the smallest voices become magnified. And because everybody's speaking, there's the people that are the caretakers standing there in the corner, and through a microphone, they have to tell people every 2 minutes to be quiet. They say, "Sss," and then everyone's quiet. And then all of a sudden, you start to hear whispers. And then the decibel meter starts to go up until it hits about 100 decibels. And then they have to say it again, and it goes down. Look at how descriptive the Quran is, that on the day of judgment, imagine a plane of billions of people. Everyone that lives on earth now, everybody that gets resurrected. So billions and billions of people, their attention is taken to the point that you hear nothing, no conversation. You only hear soft sounds. فَلَا تَسْمَعُ إِلَّا هَمْسًا. So khasha'a, to bring down. So the Quran says the first behavior of prayer is الَّذِينَ هُمْ فِي صَلَاتِهِمْ خَاشِعُونَ. That they're humble. That they're lowly. They're humble. I'll talk about what that means. The second is in chapter number 70. الَّذِينَ هُمْ عَلَى صَلَاتِهِمْ دَائِمُونَ. Da'imun refers to people who are constant. So you don't just pray once and expect all of your answers to come within a day. You're constant. You constantly pray. You're consistent with it. Even if you don't get what you want. Most human beings, because we live in an instant gratification world, an on-demand world, we have a very weak faith muscle. So we expect to get every time we push a button. But that's not how prayer works. Prayer is not just a button that you push. It's a muscle that you develop. So those who are constant, this is number 2. Number 3, وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ عَلَى صَلَاتِهِمْ يُحَافِظُونَ. People who are mindful when it comes to their prayers. So those are 3. One is humble. The second is constant, repetitive. And the third is mindful. Contrary to that, there's also a type of prayer which the Quran describes as nothing but noise. Some people, their prayer is nothing but a physical activity. It's just to get the blood flowing in their body and their brain. It's just a way for them to make noise. He says when he describes the pagan Arabs, وَمَا كَانَ صَلَاتُهُمْ عِنْدَ الْبَيْتِ إِلَّا مُكَاءً وَتَصْدِيَةً. That their prayer, the pagan Arabs, they would come and visit the Kaaba as well. But what did their prayer consist of? Whistling and clapping. Imagine people in Al-Masjid al-Haram whistling and clapping. They were just making noise. To them, that was their salat. That was their prayer. So this is what the Quran tells us about prayer. So what does that mean in terms of application? How does that become relevant in terms of application? Well, number one, when you look at the attribute of khashi'un, humble. Humble reflects an attitude. One of the commandments of Luqman, the wise, to his son was to walk in a state of humility and be humble. So humble reflects an attitude. And your attitude determines your altitude. So what's the attitude that you have? Do you expect good things to happen in your life? When you expect good things to happen in your life, good things happen in your life. When you have optimism instead of pessimism, great things start to happen in your life. And the term for that, the phrase for that in Arabic is husn al-dhann, to have optimism. And if you study some of the supplications of our imams, they talk about having optimism when it comes to receiving forgiveness from God. Having optimism and hope in the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Al-Imam Zainul Abidin alayhi salam, he says, in the treasure that is Dua Abu Hamza Thumali, وَأَنَا يَا رَبِّ عَائِدٌ بِفَضْلِكَ هَارِبٌ مِنْكَ إِلَيْكَ مُتَنَجِّزٌ مَا وَعَدْتَ مِنَ الصَّفْحِ عَمَّنْ أَحْسَنَ بِكَ ظَنَّا. My Lord, that I am running from you towards you. And when I run towards you, I'm banking on and I'm hoping that you would deliver on the mercy that you have promised the people who have optimism towards you. Even though when you look at my statement, it's full of mischief. It's full of disobedience. So my statement is not going to earn me your rewards. It's not going to earn me your forgiveness. I haven't done anything. But what I do have on my side is I have hope. I have optimism. There's a narration, and this is more of a figurative narration, but it's found in our hadith books regardless. It describes what happens on the Day of Judgment. That everybody begins to see the reality and the consequences of what they did in this life. And so when you see everything in front of you, there's no arguing anymore. It's normally when there's no evidence that you begin to argue, but when the evidence is there, you don't argue anymore. So people are split. Some people are directed towards the heaven, some people are directed towards the hell. And the narration says there's one more person. And because of his balance sheet, he's directed towards the hellfire. And as he is walking towards the hellfire, he turns around and he addresses Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he says the equivalent of, this is not what I expected. I expected more out of you. I was optimistic. I was hopeful when it came to your mercy, when it came to receiving and attaining your forgiveness. And the narration says that because of that, he is directed towards the heaven. It's metaphorical because on that day nothing changes in reality. But it's a metaphorical hadith. We have a number of metaphorical hadith. That because of his optimism and because of his hope, and when you begin to study the science behind hope, you realize, and I'll talk about this, that how hope affects people's health. And unfortunately, in a lot of medical circles, a lot of medical professionals, they tend to strip hope from people when they give them the diagnosis, even though it's very well-intentioned. So khashi'un refers to your attitude. What kind of attitude do you have? When you ask God for something, do you actually expect it to come true? Or is it, hey, I'm just going to kind of try this and let's see if it works? Most people have that sort of attitude. But when you have a hopeful expectation of something coming to life. This is number one. Number two is the second attribute. Da'imun. People who are constant. People who have a habit of repetition. And when you repeat something, it creates wonders. Some of you are probably familiar with the 10,000 hour rule. There was a book written recently, a very popular book, and what the author says is when you look at the most successful people in different fields, the reason why they're successful isn't because they have a magic pill or anything like that. They don't have a magic formula. They practice their trade for 10,000 hours. They were repetitive. Whatever you repeat, you become good at. That's why sometimes you see they have videos on YouTube of skilled workers. If you've ever gotten caught in that YouTube video cycle like most people do, skilled workers, people who work at insanely fast speeds. They don't work like that from day one. They work like that because they've worked on it for 10 and 15 and 20 and 30 years of their life. It's repetition. So what's the science behind that? Why does the Quran talk about repetitiveness and being constant when it comes to your prayer? If you look at the brain, and if you're familiar with the field of neuroplasticity, what's neuroplasticity? Neuroplasticity is the theory that suggests that our brains as adults are constantly growing. It doesn't stop growing. And that there are ways to create neurological pathways in the brain. And this even has physiological effects to it. In fact, there's data, if you look it up, there's data that proves that neuroplasticity therapy can help people who have suffered from a stroke and even mild concussions. It can help people who have taken on certain addictive disorders. Because what it allows you to do is to create new pathways in the brain. And so you help the brain heal itself and develop new habits. It's called neuroplasticity. One of the ways that you can use neuroplasticity towards your advantage is through repetition. Anything that you do repetitively. So that's why you see people who are very, very skilled, they don't put as much effort into the skill that they're doing anymore. Why? Because the brain sort of goes on autopilot. Because it has so many neurological pathways that it's on autopilot. But if you haven't created those neurological pathways in your mind, then there's no autopilot. So when you're repetitively saying something, this is the way that you can use neuroplasticity towards your advantage, through repetition. So for instance, there's a lot of truth to repeating positive affirmations on a daily basis. If you have positive affirmations, if you tell yourself that you're worthy, that you're loved, that you're confident, that you're strong, that you're capable, that you're smart, that you're intelligent, that you're loved, that you give love. If you repeat that to yourself on a daily basis, try it. And some of you are thinking, and there's some people out there that are very skeptical of this. They say, no, that's just positivity, motivation, mumbo jumbo. Okay, well, try the opposite. Go out for a year and repeat negative affirmations to yourself. Wake up in the morning and 10 times a day say, I'm stupid, I'm stupid, I'm stupid, I'm stupid. See what happens to you after a year. So you create these neurological pathways in your mind, and then you become it. Your behavior becomes it. That's why the Quran says that they are constant and they are repetitive when it comes to their prayer. Not just they pray one time. Have you noticed that? When we do tasbihat, it's not just that we say subhanallah one time. You say it 30 some times. Allahu Akbar, the same thing. Subhanallah, the same thing. Because the more you repeat it, the more it becomes part of your subconscious mind, and the more what you're saying manifests itself in reality. This is number 2. Number 3 is yuhafidun. They're mindful. What is mindfulness? Now, I know there's this new age thing called mindfulness, and now it's a very cool thing. They're writing books on mindfulness and podcasts and blogs. But mindfulness is really a concept that has existed for thousands of years. What mindfulness just means is that you're present. So if you're sitting in a lecture hall, you're present. If you're praying, you're present. If someone you love is speaking to you, you're present. Your mind isn't somewhere else. Your body isn't somewhere else. Just to be present. And part of that is just common courtesy, being present. But there's a lot of power to that. And what I want to talk about when it comes to mindfulness is not being distracted by anything else. Not mixing positive emotions with negative emotions. When you're praying, what kind of emotions are in your heart when you're praying to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? What kind of emotions are supposed to be in your heart? There are positive emotions and there are negative. What are some positive emotions? Hope, love, generosity, kindness. Those are positive emotions. What are some negative emotions? Fear, greed, superstition, jealousy. So imagine standing in front of God and praying and being mindful. What that means is that you focus on positive emotions. You don't allow any negative emotions to come and distract you. Because positive emotions and negative emotions cannot exist in the same place at the same time. So you cannot have faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but also fear Him. Now I'll talk about what fear means because the Quran tells us to fear. But I'm talking about fear that something's not going to come true. You can't have faith and fear at the same time. You can't be generous in the same way. You can't be generous and greedy at the same time. You can't love and hate at the same time. It just doesn't exist in one place. And that's why the Quran says in chapter 33, مَا جَعَلَ اللَّهُ لِرَجُلٍ مِّن قَلْبَيْنِ فِي جَوْفِهِ, that God has not created two hearts for a man inside his chest. Not literally two organs. One time someone came up to me and said, well, the Quran is wrong because some guy was born with two hearts. And this is what happens when we look at the Quran on a very surface level. Beyond that, what the commentators have said is that two conflicting emotions cannot exist in the heart at the same time. So you can't be greedy and generous at the same time. You can't have love and hatred at the same time. They talk about a love-hate relationship. That doesn't exist at the same time. You can't love something and hate something at the same time. There's different stages. So when it comes to positive and negative emotions, there's a lot to be said, but I just want to focus on this positive emotion and this one, faith versus fear. When it comes to our salah, and when we stand in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how we need to be single-minded when it comes to our faith. See, one of the effects of faith and fear is physiological. There was a professor by the name of Norman Cousins. He was a professor of psychiatry and behavioral science at UCLA. And by profession, he was a journalist. He wasn't a doctor, he was a journalist. But he started researching the biomedical field, and then he himself became sick with an autoimmune disease. So he had done some research, and so he decided that when he became sick with the autoimmune disease, that he wasn't going to take negativity from anyone. Not from the doctor, not from people at home, so he sort of just put himself aside. And he talks about the treatment and how he cured himself of his autoimmune disease. He says, number one, I took large doses of vitamin C. So he did something physical. He said, number two is that I began to cure my autoimmune disease through positive emotions, such as faith. He says, I began to change my behavior. Anytime someone would want to say something negative or sympathize, put that aside. He said, I began to intentionally laugh. I began to engage in humorous acts so I could laugh. And the type of autoimmune disease that he had was so painful, it was causing him so much pain that he couldn't even sleep. So he said, what I would do, and this is documented. He wrote a number of books. One of his books is called Anatomy of an Illness. You can look it up. He said, I would turn on candid camera shows. Who doesn't like candid camera shows? And everybody likes a candid camera show. And he says that I would engage in 10 minutes of belly laughter. I would laugh as much as I could. He said and I began to notice a formula and a pattern. Every 10 minutes of belly laughter that I would produce would afford me 2 hours of painless sleep. And so he became more interested in this. He started doing more. So he says that he cured himself from his autoimmune disease. Many years later, him and his wife both faced heart disease, and they were able to cure themselves again. So he started to do research. He says that when you have hope and when you have faith and when you have positive emotions, physiologically it begins to cure you in a way that some modern techniques, some modern medicines can never do. So they started to do research, and one of the pieces of research, he found that when a person laughs or when they have positive emotions such as hope and such as courage and such as victory, the spleen begins to produce red blood cells that if a person is suffering from cancer, it goes straight to the cancer cells and it kills them without the need for chemotherapy, because chemotherapy kills the malignant cells and the good cells. But this type of therapy, what he called laughter therapy, would go straight to the cancer cells and kill them. Literally, it would heal them. The opposite is also true. Have you seen when people are terrified of illness? When they're terrified of sickness? When just the sound of sickness makes them tremble, what eventually happens to these people? They get sick and die. Most of them. You probably have examples within your own extended family. I've seen it myself within extended family. People who are terrified, eventually they become sick because they allow fear to take over faith. And a positive emotion and a negative emotion cannot exist in one place at the same time. That's why the Quran talks about mindfulness, being single-minded. When you focus on your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and no one else, only with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this begins to shed light and explain on what happened to Fir'aun during his final moments. What happened? Finally, when the sea was closing, when he saw that that's it, I'm wrong and they're right. And of course, Fir'aun throughout his life, he saw himself as a god. If you read his story in the Quran, he saw himself as a god. He was untouchable. Finally, when the waves came crashing and he knew he was going to die, the Quran quotes him. He says, قَالَ آمَنْتُ أَنَّهُ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا الَّذِي آمَنَتْ بِهِ بَنُو إِسْرَائِيل. He doesn't say La ilaha illallah. He says, La ilaha illa alladhi amanat bihi banu Israel. Meaning whatever those guys are doing, whatever God they believe in, I believe in too. No faith. No single-mindedness. He was still thinking about other things. He was still thinking about his kingdom. Because if he was sincere, he would have said La ilaha illallah. But he said, the God of Banu Israel, whatever they're worshipping is now good for me. And there's a narration attached to this. The narration, if I'm not mistaken, is from the 8th Imam, Al-Imam Ali ibn Musa al-Rada. He says this is the reason. Because he did not call out for God himself. He was not sincere. He was not single-minded. And that's why we need to reflect and say, well, the prayers, if you think about it, think about some of the things that have come true in your life because of prayer. One writer, who's a secular writer, he doesn't even mention God when he talks about this, but he says that during those times that you asked for something and it was granted, reflect on the state of mind that you had. Think about it. Most likely the state of mind that you were in the state of tadarru'. What is tadarru'? Tadarru' is an on your knees type of dedication. Not just I ask, but I beg. I don't find hope in anything else. I'm single-minded in my purpose. There's nothing else that's distracting me. So when you look at it from a psychological point of view, when you look at it from a physiological point of view, when you look at it from a spiritual and an emotional point of view, it makes sense why the Quran uses specific words when it talks about effective prayer. Not just people who are praying and saying words like the people who were whistling and clapping, but people who had the right attitude, optimism, belief. People who were constant, they were consistent. No matter what, they were going to pray. Affirmations. And number 3 is single-mindedness. Mindfulness and being single-minded in your purpose. Al-Imam Zayn al-Abidin alayhi salam has a beautiful way of expressing this in Dua Abu Hamza al-Thumali. Alhamdulillah alladhi la ad'u ghayrah walau da'awtu ghayrahu lam yastajib li du'ai. If I ask anybody else, if I'm dual-minded, and I ask somebody else and I ask you, it's not going to take place. But if I only ask you, it's going to take place. Just one final point I mentioned when it comes to fear, because some of you might think, okay, well, fear, the Quran talks about fear, إِنِّي أَخَافُ اللَّهَ رَبَّ الْعَالَمِينَ, that fear can be a positive emotion as well. The type of fear that's a positive emotion, that's a positive driver, is not fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's not fear of Him as a boogie monster. It's not that. Fear, what religious scholars have said, fear of God, when you talk about fear of God, it's the fear of our own capacity for our self-destructive nature. Because we have a self-destructive nature. So fear is not fear of God. It's fear of our own self-destructive nature. And so putting all this into context, it makes sense when you study the life of Al-Imam Sayyid al-Shuhada Abi Abdullah al-Husayn alayhi salam, and the words that he chose to speak, how precise he was in his dua. In one of the coming nights, inshallah, I will share with you some of the words of Dua Arafah, a very, very special supplication that belongs to Imam Hussein alayhi salam. But there was a special dua that the Imam spoke on the day of Ashura. Allahumma anta thiqati fi kulli karb, wa anta raja'i fi kulli musibah. Oh Allah, you are the most trustworthy one when it comes to difficult challenges and ordeals. Wa anta raja'i fi kulli musibah. You are the one that I plead with. You are the one that I turn to in times of calamity, in times of challenges. I don't turn to anyone else. The dua says that every mishap, every challenge that comes my way, أنزلته بك وشكوته إليك رغبة مني إليك عمن سواك. That I prefer you, I prefer coming to you, O Allah, over everyone else. There are some people that would be able to support you here and there, but I know that you are the number one choice. You are at the top of my list. So I am single-minded in my purpose when it comes to my relationship with you. I don't believe that if God isn't going to give it to me, I'm going to go to someone else and they can give it to me. And that's the mindset of many people today. That's why a lot of people lose their spirituality and lose their religion. No, God didn't give it to me. It's a very, very transactional mindset. I gave this to God, God didn't give it to me, I'm going to go give my product elsewhere, and perhaps I'm going to get it elsewhere. Imam Hussein says, no, not at all. رَغْبَةً مِنِّي إِلَيْكَ عَمَّنْ سِوَاكَ. I have a desire to share everything that I have with you and only with you and no one else. This was the single-mindedness of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. And this is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave Imam Hussein what He gave him. This is why Imam Hussein today owns the hearts of millions of people worldwide, because he was single-minded in his purpose. And people follow you as a leader, as a father, as a mother, as a big brother, as a community leader, when you're courageous, when you're single-minded, not when you're dual-minded. A jack of all trades, a master of none. And that's very real when it comes to your faith and your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Tonight is the night that we commemorate the martyrdom of the ambassador of Imam Hussein alayhi salam, Muslim ibn Aqil. And just to give you a very short synopsis, Muslim ibn Aqil was obviously the cousin of Imam Hussein alayhi salam, and he was a very, very trusted man. When the letters began to arrive to Imam Hussein from Kufa to invite him to come in and lead the community there, he sent his emissary Muslim bin Aqil. Narration said that he also sent a couple of people, but they did not make it. And with much difficulty, Muslim arrives to the city of Kufa. And when he first arrives, he stays in the home of Al-Mukhtar bin Abi Ubaid al-Thaqafi, who later revolts, who is in prison during the time of Ashura, but then comes out of prison and then he revolts. When he arrives there, the governor of Al-Kufa is An-Nu'man ibn Bashir. And An-Nu'man ibn Bashir, some describe him as a passive person, that he said that as long as the politics remain, untouched, then it's okay. Let Muslim be here. But some of the Umayyads there, they were concerned for the situation, so they wrote multiple letters to Yazid ibn Muawiyah in Damascus. Yazid sends a letter to Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad, who at that time was the governor of Basra. He says, go to Kufa right away and take care of the situation. So Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad, he gets up and leaves. He has a number of people with him. And he doesn't really have any supporters, but he's a master of disguise. So narration says that he cloaks and he covers himself in a way so that people think that he is the Imam and that he has arrived. And he enters the city of Kufa. And An-Nu'man ibn Bashir doesn't recognize him in the beginning. But he tells him, I'm here to take things over. You're officially resigned. So he takes over. When he takes over, he understands that Muslim ibn Aqil is in Kufa. So it's not safe for Muslim to stay in one place. So he begins to move around. He goes to the home of Hani ibn Urwa, one of the trusted companions. To make a long story short, there was so much pressure and there was so much alienation that Muslim ibn Aqil found himself a number of days later alone, because people had been threatened that whoever supports him shall be beheaded, shall be taken into custody, shall be held responsible. So most everyone was fearful. And so Muslim, this trusted ambassador, after arriving into the city and having thousands of supporters, he finds himself alone, wahid and farida, walking in the streets of Kufa, alone, thirsty, with no one to help him, until finally narrations say that he arrived at the doorsteps of a very righteous woman by the name of Tawa. And he asks her, because of his thirst, he asks her for a drink of water. And she provides him with a drink of water. And after he's done, he does not leave her doorstep. So she turns to him, she says, Ya Abdullah, this is not an appropriate situation. I am a woman and you are here, you're a foreigner, you're sitting at my doorstep and I've given you what you wanted. Why are you lingering around? Why are you still here? He says, my lady, I have nowhere to go. And he introduces himself. He says, I am Muslim ibn Aqil. I am the ambassador of Hussein ibn Ali. I am here to fulfill the mission. And he informs her that people have sold me out, people have abandoned me, there is no one who is supporting me anymore. So she brings him in, she provides refuge for him. Narrations say that he spent the entire night in worship, entire night, because he knew what was going to happen. And when the morning arrives, she had a son who was working for the army of Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad, so he informed the soldiers of the whereabouts. So the soldiers come to the door of Tawa. Narrations say hundreds, maybe thousands of them were there, but there was a very, very narrow alleyway, so it was difficult for them to get to the home. So Muslim ibn Aqil, he comes out and he confronts them. And he knows, just like his master, Sayyid al-Shuhada Abi Abdullah al-Hussein, that no way to die is to get, being arrested is not the way to go. And so he fights. And narration says that he engages in battle with them right there. And because of his bravery, he begins to subdue the enemies, one after another, after another, after another, until finally they begin to surround from the rooftops. Narrations say that they found a way to dig a hole behind him, and that he fell into the hole. And finally they were able to capture him, and the person that captured him was Muhammad ibn al-Ash'ath. And finally they brought him as a captive to the governorship, the palace of governorship of Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad. And he says, I have a number of requests. Now by that time he is bleeding, and they wanted to give him water. So they brought for him a cup of water, and the blood from his mouth began to spill into the water. So he could not drink it because it had blood in it. So they poured it out. They brought him more water. Again, the blood began to pour in it. He poured it out. They brought it again. His blood began to pour into it, until finally he realized that it is my destiny to also die thirsty. They said, do you have any requests? A narration says that he spoke to one of the soldiers in the corner. He says, yes, I have 3 requests. Number 1, I have a loan that I want you to pay off of 700 dirhams. I want you to pay that off. I have money in Medina. Please ask for it to be paid off. Number 2, I want you to give my body a proper burial after you do what you do. This is my second request. And number 3, I want you to send message to my master Hussein and tell him that the people of Kufa have sold us out and they have changed their minds. Do not come here, for if you come here, surely you will meet your demise. Of course, they did not grant him his request. The money issue they did not care about, but the second 2 requests they did not grant. Narrations say that they took him up to the rooftop, and to make an example out of him, they assassinated him, they executed him, they beheaded him, and they pushed his body off of the rooftop. Then they took his body and they dragged it in the streets of Kufa to make an example out of it. Narrations tell us that the news arrived to Imam Hussein alayhi salam during one of his stops on the way. And when Imam Hussein alayhi salam received the news of the assassination of Muslim ibn Aqil, he turned to the women folk, he turned to the tent of the women, and he said, bring for me Hamida, the daughter of Muslim. When they brought for him Hamida, he embraced her, he wiped his hand above her head since she had become an orphan. Then he directed her to go to her cousins, who would now become her sisters and her family members. Inna lillah wa inna ilayhi raji'un, wa saya'lamu alladhina zalamu ayya munqalabin yanqalibun, wal aqibatu lil muttaqin. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.